The Nikon Zf is a powerhouse of a camera with a unique vintage design, and it offers one of the best shooting experiences because not only is it a great vintage style photo camera, but it's also a surprisingly solid video and vlogging camera, making it a great hybrid and lifestyle camera overall. But does the Nikon Zf actually deliver, and how does it compare to its main competitor, Fujifilm? So in this video, let's find out if the Nikon Zf is actually worth the hype. Now usually I like to start my videos off with the camera specs, but it's hard to ignore the design of the Nikon Zf, and it's probably the reason most of you guys are even interested in it. The Nikon Zf is actually modeled after the Nikon FM, which is a camera from 1977. Holding the Nikon Zf in my hands, right away I'm like, wow, this feels like a real photo camera, and it has a bit of heft to it, but in a good way. The body's actually made out of magnesium alloy, which is very robust, but sadly the bottom plate is actually plastic, which is not as durable, but the rest of the camera feels really great. And it also has a rubberized faux leather finish around the camera that helps add a bit of like texture and grip to it, but also just makes the camera look that much nicer. And this camera also comes in several different colorways, so you can get the exact camera you want that matches your personality and style. Personally, I really like the military green and orange. One issue that some of you guys might have with this camera that it's a very thin camera and it doesn't have the biggest grip. You can buy a third-party grip from like Small Rig or Newer, but personally I like how slim this camera is. Now with the Nikon Zf being a vintage style camera, you do have a very different set of buttons and dials on this camera. At first this might seem a little bit intimidating, but two things to keep in mind is that one, these dials actually help to improve your photo experience, and two, you still have your regular command dials on this camera, so you could use this as your standard mirrorless camera, but you kind of be missing the point of this camera. On the right hand side, you have your shutter dial that goes anywhere from 1/800th of a second, which is super fast, to 4 seconds for long exposure. And you also have a bulb mode and time mode for long exposure, but also a flash sync mode that is 1/200th of a second. Now, one issue that I did have with this dial is that it only doubles your shutter speed. So if you're in a situation where you need to just go from 1/80th of a second to 100th of a second, you actually have to switch this dial into automatic mode and then use the command wheel on the back, which is kind of slow to do. On the left side, you have an ISO dial that will go anywhere between 100 to 51,200, but that doesn't mean all of the ISO ranges will actually look good, and we'll chat more about how the ISO looks on this camera later on in the low light section. And the aperture on this camera by default is actually set to the front command dial because not all Nikon lenses have an aperture ring. But this camera is super customizable, and I actually use the focus ring to change my aperture to get closer to that old school shooting experience. Using this camera in a fully manual mode is a very satisfying and tactile experience and makes you feel more involved with your image making. If you're someone that's a photographer, you totally get what I'm talking about. Like, I love the way these dials sound and the shutter just, If you're not a photographer or if you just don't care about image making, you're gonna think I'm crazy. But those who know, no. Now, just because it's a vintage style camera doesn't mean that it doesn't have the quality of life features you need on a modern camera. For example, this camera is completely customizable. I actually use the front custom button to use to change my picture profiles, and I have the autofocus button on the back used to change my crop modes. This way you can set this camera up exactly how you want while maintaining all of that vintage style pizzazz. And two other things that I should mention about this camera is that it also has a mode selector to go between photo, video, and a dedicated black and white mode. If you're someone that likes to shoot this type of camera, chances are you probably love black and white, and it's really cool to have a dedicated black and white mode on this camera. And another thing that I love about the Nikon Zf is the viewfinder. This is one of the best viewfinders I've ever used on any camera. It's a really large screen and a very comfortable and immersive viewing experience. It really makes me feel closer to my images, which is exactly what this style of camera is for. And on top of that, it's also got a 60 Hz refresh rate, so there's no lag with this viewfinder. Now, one thing that some of you guys might love or hate is that the screen on the back is actually a side articulating screen. Most photographers don't prefer this, but if you're going to be using this for any kind of video, this is exactly the screen you need. And it's also 100% touch sensitive, giving you control over all of your major settings like shutter, aperture, and ISO, and your menus as well. So you can kind of use this like a modern camera if you ever decide you're bored of the vintage controls. But two things that anyone can appreciate about this camera is one, the insane battery life. I shot for almost a week straight for photos and videos, and I did not run out of battery, but on top of that, it also has a dual SD card slot. However, only one of those card slots is a standard SD card and the other one is a micro SD card slot. But both cards are equally fast and you will not have any issues with the read and write or buffering. On the outside, the Nikon Zf is a very cool and stylish camera, and I've had so many people wanting to start conversations about this camera at bars and parties. But as nice as this camera is on the outside, how does it look on the inside, and are the photos and videos worth the price tag of this camera? On the inside, you have a 24 megapixel full frame sensor. This is a big deal because the main competitor to the Nikon Zf, the Fuji cameras or the Ricoh GR series, only have an APS-C size sensor, and by having a full frame sensor, you're going to get a lot of benefits. One of those main benefits being that the Nikon Zf is very good in low light. It has a dual native ISO of 800 or 6400, meaning you can shoot at either ISO and get perfectly clean results. And the kit lens that the Nikon Zf comes with is either a 28mm or 40mm lens, and both of these lenses are also f2, meaning this camera package will not struggle in low light, which I think a lot of people will probably want because this is one of those cameras you really want to go shoot at nighttime with. And the sensor also has 5-axis stabilization, which works really great for handheld video and slow shutter photos. And you can really see the massive difference in stabilized video and non-stabilized video. But my favorite thing about the Nikon Zf is something that really surprised me, and that is the autofocus. I was ready to just be like, oh, it has bad autofocus, it's wonky, Nikon can't do autofocus. But this camera is super solid. Both for photos and videos, the autofocus is super reliable. It locks onto the eyes and does not let go. Even with the subject matter moving all over the place, it does a really good job. The autofocus in the Nikon Zf is now easily as good as the Sony a7 IV or Sony FX3, which are really good cameras for autofocus. And Nikon now also has AI-based subject detection in their cameras. So overall, it's super impressive, and they've come a really long way with their autofocus. And the Nikon Zf is a powerhouse of a camera when it comes to photo and video shooting speeds. In photo mode, it can shoot 14 frames per second with up to 25 lossless compression RAW photos in a row. But if you simply switch over to compressed RAW photos, you actually get 14 frames per second with up to 127 RAW photos in a row. And if you really like to shoot action, you also have a 30 frames per second electronic shutter mode, which is as fast as video, and you can shoot 210 photos in a row. Sadly, in electronic shutter mode, you can only shoot JPEGs. When it comes to video, the Nikon Zf shoots 4K at 24 and 30 frames per second, but this 4K is also downsampled from 6K, giving you 6K detail and clarity, but in a smaller and easier to edit 4K file. And the Zf also shoots 4K at 60 frames per second. Sadly, in this mode, there's no downsampling, and there's also a pretty heavy crop on your sensor, but it's not too bad because that's also the same thing the a7 IV does, which is a very popular camera. And the Zf can also shoot 120 frames per second in full HD for 5x slow motion. But the best part about the Zf is that it also has N-Log available in its main 10-bit color mode, giving you a ton more flexibility over your light values and colors. If you wanted to, you could easily take this camera and make it look cinematic and like a professional video camera. So it doesn't just have to be a vintage style photo camera. Now, one thing that I should mention is that while shooting video, I did not have any sort of overheating. I shot at 4K at 24 and 30 frames per second and 4K at 60 frames per second, and the battery died in every single case before the camera overheated, but I did have the temperature setting set to high. Overheating tests are kind of stupid because it depends on where you are, but in my experience, it worked perfectly fine. So from a video shooter's perspective, this is a very solid video camera, and I love this side articulating screen that you can also use for vlogging. This is one of those cameras that can really double up as your video camera if you needed to. And this way, it might be an easier purchase to make knowing that you can get really good video from this. But one major problem that video shooters might have with this camera is that the screen on the side actually gets in the way of the HDMI port and the headphone jack or your mic jack. This is definitely not ideal, but I'm not super mad about it because at the end of the day, if you're gonna use this for serious video work, you're probably going to plug a monitor at the top. And if you're vlogging with it, the screen should be just fine, even if it's a little obstructed by the mic jack. Now, let's talk about the most important thing on this camera, and that is colors. If you're going to be shooting a vintage film style camera, you probably also want the look of a vintage film camera. And there's actually a few different methods for getting the film look on them, so let's talk about them. And the last one is probably the best way to do it in my opinion. Nikon has their own looks built into this camera. They're also customizable looks, and you can even dial in the intensity. However, I tried everything I could to get these looks to not look cheesy. And for the most part, they don't really look like film, especially when you compare it to Fujifilm profiles. And there's also no way to add grain or chrome effect in camera, which is a big part of that Fujifilm look. Some of you guys might still enjoy the stylized look of these profiles, but personally, I just don't think it looks like film. However, the way that I've seen most people on the internet actually get the film look from this camera is by actually using a website called Nikon Picture Control. On this website, you can actually download a film-like profile and you have dozens to choose from and install that into your camera. It's a really easy and seamless process, and this does get you a lot closer to that filmic look. These film profiles definitely get you a lot closer to the filmic look, but they don't really make me go, wow, this looks like film. And personally, I think these profiles also look a lot better for video where I want a subtle filmic look rather than a bold stylized look for photos. Now, the last method for getting a filmic look from the Nikon Zf, and this is the method that I would use, is to actually connect the Nikon Zf to my phone. And the Zf does a really good job with the Wi-Fi connection. It's a really easy process. And to actually use an app on my phone called Dehancer. This app is going to give you a very simple process of getting the film look on your camera. It's also going to give you a ton of option on dialing in that exact look you want. And this honestly makes the Nikon Zf photos look way more like film than any of the other two methods. Now, the Dehancer app is about $99 per year, so it may not be for everyone if you don't want to spend more money. Personally, I really like the results I get from it, and I've been using it for about 2 years. Hashtag not sponsored. So is the Nikon Zf worth it, and who exactly is this camera for? If you're a photographer that wants this vintage style shooting experience, but maybe you also need just a little bit of video, maybe you have a client on the side, maybe you just want to have the ability to vlog, so it's really nice to know that this is mainly your photo camera, but it does have the video features you need. The shooting experience on the Nikon Zf is phenomenal. It's one of those cameras that really makes you fall in love with photography. If you're someone that wants the filmic look in camera, this is not the camera to get. I do not think this even comes close to a Fuji camera. However, I would say the ergonomics on this camera are more enjoyable than a Fuji camera, and I love how much horsepower there is in this camera. I can see someone that wants a solid shooting experience but still wants to edit their photos would be really into this camera. Someone that wants everything in camera and just wants a lifestyle camera, probably not for you, but it's a good lifestyle camera for pro photographers. And one type of video shooter that I can imagine buying this camera, even if they don't care about photography, is someone that actually wants a Nikon Z6 Mark II, but the Nikon Zf actually has better autofocus and a better processor in this camera. So instead of waiting for the Nikon Z6 Mark II or Mark III, I would rather just buy the Nikon Zf and get the better features. But the one reason I think a lot of people are going to buy the Nikon Zf and a lot of people buy the Fuji X100 series is because not only is this camera a whole lot of nostalgia, but it's also a fashion accessory. This camera is a conversation starter. You take this camera somewhere, people will talk to you about it. This is just a cool camera that, like, even if you're a serious photographer, you just want to have it for the coolness factor. I think Nikon did a really good job with the ergonomics, and they're totally going to tap into that market of photographers that just want that premium design. Plus, it doesn't hurt that this is a powerhouse of a camera on the inside. So if you decide to buy one of these cameras, make sure to check out the links in the description down below for the best pricing on this camera, and I will see you in the next video, hopefully where I own this camera. Peace.